Well, I want to go ahead and welcome everyone to the Alden Kindred of America's presentation of History in a Crust, the story of America's first pastries. My name is Desiree Mobed, and I'm the Executive Director. The Alden Kindred of America preserves and shares the legacy of Mayflower passengers John and Priscilla Alden at the Alden House Historic Site, their family homestead in Duxbury, Massachusetts. Today, we are very honored to welcome Plymouth food historian Paula Marcoux, who will explore the tastier side of history with this talk about Pilgrim pastries as we turn our thoughts to Thanksgiving and the 400th anniversary of that famous harvest feast. Paula has a background in archaeology, cooking, and living history. She is the food editor of Edible South Shore and South Coast, the executive director of Plymouth Craft, and the author of Cooking with Fire. Today's program is supported by a grant from the Duxbury Cultural Council, a local agency which is supported by the Massachusetts Cultural Council, a state agency. After Paula's talk, we encourage you to ask questions by typing them into the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. For anyone who has to leave early, we are recording this and it will be posted. So now let's go ahead and welcome Paula Marcoux. Hello, Paula.
Hi. Thank you, Desiree. It's really an honor to be here, and it's very exciting to be talking about pies this time of year, or really any time, because I'm a true pie devotee. Today's story is full of pies and also full of heartache and difficulty and many other things as well. I'm going to dive right in. Today I'll be describing two situations that occurred in early 17th century within a few dozen miles of where I sit at the eastern edge of the traditional homeland of the Wampanoag people. Separated by just 17 years and a short span of Cape Cod Bay, these two seemingly unrelated events, one volatile, the other celebratory, they both revolved around Indigenous interactions with Europeans, but the unifying theme for both of them was the baking of pies. If that sounds like a ridiculous approach to a serious topic, please have patience and hear me out. It can't be denied that pie baking was arguably one of the more frou-frou aspects of European culture. And even to me, as a pie baker, it seems remarkable that these individuals would choose to be making pastry in the rather extreme conditions that are revealed in the documents. Trying to gain an understanding of historical events through the study of pastry seems like a strange proposition. We are accustomed to consider the act of colonizing a continent a deadly serious business, and we tend to think of pies and tarts as silly treats. So after I give you a little information in general about 17th century pies and baking, we'll explore each of these incidents as they come to us from 17th century narratives, and then I'll show you some of the process of recreating these pies. So first, what was pie in the early 17th century? If you've ever made a pie, you know there's some finesse required, and even if you haven't, you can tell by these images that there's a lot going on, and they don't just wake up in the morning and know how to craft something this elaborate looking and presumably delicious tasting. Pies in the period were extremely varied, and as you can see, could be very, very fine presentations, very artificial, to use the word a 17th century English people would use to describe the manipulation of ingredients to no longer even resemble what they had begun as. The fillings could be made of virtually anything, cheese, meat, fruit, sweet or savory, or sweet and savory at the same time. They had a lot of, there was a lot of very subtle knowledge about how to make different types of crusts to do exactly the types of jobs that need to happen for each of the applications of these pastries. All the ingredients that are found in pies, you could make those things into food just by boiling and roasting them, but making them into a pastry creates a lot more difficulty, and is it's an added choice that you've made you're making a statement when you make a pie rather than just serve a boiled piece of meat. So the other part that makes pies more difficult is that they're baked in ovens. You need to have an oven to create a pie, and that in itself is an investment. I'm showing you some images here of ovens to give you an idea of their age. You can see a Roman an image of one, a medieval image of one, and one of reproduction of me baking in one in 1990. But they all have this, they all operate in the same way. There's a large masonry mass, you heat it up with a fire, you clean out the coals and ashes, and you put the bread in, close the door up, and the bread bakes in the heat that's retained in the oven. The way they work also involves retained heat. So you're not baking with the actual flames there. You can see where the fire is on the left-hand side of this 19th century Plymouth oven. You can see in figure 2 that the fire is burning down, and you sweep out the coals and ashes, and you can see how nice and clean the bricks are. All the char is burnt off by the heat. Put the bread in, and figure 3 is the one that's not there, where the door is closed and shows you that the bread is closed up in the oven and the heat is not escaping. And figure 4 is taking out this nice loaf of bread thereafter. And how do we know about ovens from the past? Through archaeology is one way. Some documents, but they're pretty scanty. These are two French and one English versions of ovens, and you can see they have a lot in common. There's sort of a weird donut-shaped structure. That's the walls of the oven. After they collapse, they leave just sort of this donut of rocks and sand and gravel and clay on the ground. And you can see in one of them, in the upper left one, the hearth, where it's vitrified clay, just burned many times over by the heating of the oven. And that it just shows the archaeologist exactly where the oven was, and that it was used a great deal before it was wrecked. And the other thing about archaeology is sometimes you'll find dishes of food and some remains of food through bones or pots, and that tells you that this animal, this may be these deer bones were from an animal that was eaten here, and you might be able to tell, an archaeologist might be able to tell that it was boiled, and maybe what it was boiled with if the pot is with it. But pastries, usually very often they're boned, so the bones are not remaining from a pastry, and they're not baked in pans or anything. The pastry is just made and put on the hearth of the oven and bakes that way. And so it doesn't leave any archaeological evidence beyond the oven. And the other thing about pies is they usually get eaten right away, so the evidence may not even be around half an hour later. And the other thing about ovens is that they were built for bread. Pies are a complete, not just second tier, but third or fourth tier food in the world of survival. Colonists were, we don't have as much information as you think about when they built ovens to start with, but they brought over tons of meal to many colonies, and because of that, we expect that the meals be made into bread in some way. And having especially for Plymouth colony, having exactly when the first ovens were created, that's just not information that we have. So the pastry being a second, third, or fourth tier food, it's very surprising to me in looking at the documents I'm about to review with you that these pastries come up so early on. So another way that we know about foodstuffs of the early modern era is through cookbooks. These are two 17th century books that were very popular in England and France, and that I've used a lot in learning about the recipes, some of the recipes that I'll share with you later on. And also imagery. The Dutch especially were wonderful draftspersons, showing very detailed imagery. This is not just the idea of what a pie might look like. This is a painting of an actual pie. You can see so much in the way of detail, even though this is not the clearest of images, in the way the pastry is put together. And anyone who has made a pie out there can just admire the crimping of the pastry, the plumb sides of the pie, and just the way the painter has rendered the sugar sprinkled top of this pie. And you can see the filling coming out of it. It looks kind of like a strange, unknowable substances until you read a recipe and can learn what might be in a pie like that. And this is could very likely be that type of pie. It's minced pie. This is an English recipe. That was a Dutch painting, but this is a very international pie. A leg of mutton boned, parboiled, sometimes raw, depending on other recipes, some suet or some other kind of fat, pepper, salt, cloves, mace, currants, raisins, prunes, sliced dates, orange peels, which might be a preserve, all mixed together and then put into the coffin, which is the word for the pastry shell, or into diverse coffins, meaning many small little pastries or chewits, they might be called, and then bake them. And when they're served, open the lids, strew on store of sugar on the top of the meat and upon the lid. And you could see from that last painting I showed you, that's exactly what's going on in there. So that brings me to our first incident. This takes place in a location you can see there, just out on what's now Chatham on the Cape, in an area that now is called Stage Harbor. At this point, in 1606, it's part of the eastern edge of the Wampanoag homeland. This is October, and the people who'd summered there at Monomoic, there at that point would be wrapping up their processing of the crops they'd grown there that summer. The women grew principally corn, beans, and squash. That we know, they were gathering grapes and other seasonal treats. The men were fishing, and they were preparing to move to better hunting grounds for the winter. At that point, these Frenchmen arrive. They're coming from, on the map on the left, Ile Sainte-Croix is a little island in the middle of the St. John's River on the border nowadays between the US and Canada, between Maine and New Brunswick. And they'd spent a winter there, and it's horrible. They almost froze to death. Half of them did die of scurvy and freezing, and they were determined to move. A whole bunch of reinforcements arrived, and they started to move to a new place at Port Royal, which is the site of Annapolis, Nova Scotia. And they began this second settlement that you see on the right at Port Royal. In both of these places, they built ovens. They had professional masons with them, I happen to know, from reading the source material from these colonies. But in the middle of this, they sent out a detachment, including the leader of the whole colony, whose name was the Sieur de Poitrincourt. Poitrincourt had taken off decided they'd take off from Ile Sainte-Croix right away at in the early summer, repeating a voyage that his sort of second, whose name was Samuel de Champlain, Champlain had done this trip the year before, and Poitrincourt went with him this summer, and they went to check out more southerly places, partly because they'd gotten their butts frozen off that winter in Ile Sainte-Croix. It was very important to them to have access to the fur trade, and they had very good access from where they were settled. But they spent that summer poking into every river they could without irritating the native peoples on this coast too much, trying to figure out if they could get access to the fur trade, get it far enough inland without having to be in such a cold locale. So they get eventually to the shoreline on that arm of Cape Cod that I'd shown you, and if you're familiar with, if you're a sailor or familiar with the coast of Monomoy now, it's incredibly shoaly, and it was then a terrible place to try to get around. There were no charts or no piloting had been done, so people had just no idea how to get around those shoals, and they were trying to maybe make for Buzzards Bay, but they just couldn't get through the sandbanks out there. So they were at that point in a pinnace, a smallish sort of very small ship, and they fetched up on a bar of sand, and they broke the pintle from their rudder, which is like basically a pin that sticks out of the back of the ship, and the rudder hangs on it. And that's a really terrible disaster. Even though the boat can still float, there's no way to make it go the way you want it to go. So they needed to find their way into shore and repair it. So if you look at this particular chart, you can see there's this very nice harbor. They sent in a small boat. They anchored their pinnace a couple miles off in a couple fathoms of water, and they send in this crazy guy named Daniel Hay, which doesn't sound like a very French name, and I'd wish to know more about this person. But he goes out in a small boat with a few other men, and they get close to shore, and some native guys yelling to him, saying literally, "Yo, yo, yo," is what it says in the sources. So they sort of negotiate by signs and figure out they need to find deep water. And this one particular native guy, gets his friends, and they help them bring the pinnace into the harbor safely. And meantime, you can see all the soundings on the left-hand side of this image that Champlain himself made, showing, how they were able to find a small channel in and then get the boat into a place where they could beach it, get out, and spend 2 weeks building a forge to repair the pintle. While they're there, because they're almost out of biscuit, they must have had flour with them, so they build an oven to bake bread, and that's, to me, an amazing thing in itself. This is the location where the English are settled. You can see they're in the middle of basically a large settlement of hundreds, maybe 600-700, they estimate, of native people. Things don't go that well in the end. So you can see from this image overall that things have gone downhill. Starts out all nice for a little while. They're trading, everyone's behaving. Then the French start getting a little bit out of hand, and they get a little pushback from some of the Wampanoag people there. And then the French response to that is to start marching around fully armed with waving swords, a guy with 2 swords at the head of the column, like waving them around crazily like a ninja. This probably doesn't play that well. And the French start to pack it up. They know it's time to go. They're going to go back to New France. And these guys are still baking, though, and they've got the last batch of bread in the oven. This is literally what it says in the source. The last batch of bread is in the oven. And they essentially are resisting getting on the ship until this is finished. So they, a small detachment, a handful of men remain on shore, and de Poutrincourt says, "All right, we're getting on the ship, and when you're done, just come back." Sometime later that night, he notices they're not there. It's sort of an afterthought. Hey, whatever happened with those baking guys? And they're like, "Oh, they're still on shore." And he's just like, "Yeah, we're going as soon as the tide turns in the morning." And so he sends his valet, his own personal valet, to go out and get them, and makes the mistake of also sending this very headstrong, sort of ne'er-do-well, but gentleman, young gentleman, out with him. When this young fellow arrives on shore, he just adds fuel to the fire. I think, and one of the sources mentions he has brandy with him, and basically it turns from a small shore party that's resistant and disobedient coming back to the ship, to some other kind of party. And the crux of this is that they don't want to return because they're now baking galettes. We learn from sources later on that this is the source of resistance, that they're baking some kinds of pastries in this oven. So they spend the night, because they will not go back to the ship except for the valet. And first thing in the morning, a large party of Wampanoag men armed with bows and arrows shoot through you can see that little thing that looks like a teepee on the top. That's actually the English baker's tent. Shoot it full of arrows, and any that survive that initial barrage are shot with arrows as they're crawling out. They drown in the brook, and one of them gets picked up. The French go by a boat and try to get the survivors. They get one guy who eventually does die of his wounds later on. But it's a debacle, basically. So as a result of it being a debacle, there's a lot of depositions about it, and that's what's helpful to me. If it weren't for the debacle, we'd never know about the pastries. So as a food historian, it's useful to me that these depositions are issued. In them, there's a lot of finger pointing and shrugging about all the irresponsibility of the young people. But the main fact emerges again and again, that the Frenchmen's unwillingness to depart was the batch of pastry. In the different sources, it's called a galette, a tart, or a gâteau, depending on the writer. So there's a lot for me to think about in how to reproduce these galettes. So first I have to think about the oven. So I've experimented at length with trying to reproduce period ovens. This is my guess about the oven at Stage Harbor, at Port Fortuné, as the French called it. This is an oven built according to the French type of oven that was popular in the period, using the types of materials that were available on site. You can see it's not an insubstantial oven, and based on what we know they were baking, they didn't have an insubstantial oven either. I'll cut this short because this is a long story in itself, but that's my guess as to the type of oven. To learn about the type of thing they're baking, here's some definitions from a great French-English dictionary of the period that only sow a great deal of confusion about galette, gâteau, tarte, and tourte and tourteau. There's interesting information in here, but they're a broad thin cake, a great cake, a smaller cake, a made dish, a cake made in haste, which is interesting. A pancake, that's another option that didn't come up in this case. And there's one here called a tarte rouge, which is where you have a fruit-filled kind of a paste, a pastry, which is also is part of the whole range of these sorts of pastries or baked goods. So I want to move right into experimenting. We used a period type of pastry, and following some hints from later galette, which remained a very simple treat that bakers would make when they're baking bread, or very simple treats for children who are bothering you while you're trying to bake. Often could be just a sheet of pastry with sugar sprinkled on it and baked, maybe some egg white on top, which of course these sailors wouldn't, or these Frenchmen would not have had. So I just used a little bit of water and some sugar on top. Sometimes it was scored, and sometimes just very simple and often oval or round presentation. We baked this in wood-fired oven. And here's I use this proportion, which is from a later cookbook, but it's a very, very, again, even as late as the early 19th century, this confusion, you can see it says fabrication du gâteau et de la galette. A gâteau and a galette are the same thing in this writer's imagination as well, even though he's a professional pastry maker of a later century. So this sort of basic old school food doesn't change much over time. So here's the one that we made using 17th century French pastry and a very basic fruit puree filling made out of the grapes that the French sources remark on again and again as being delicious. They even dug up a lot of plants to try to bring home to France, but in the confusion, they left them behind, and the apothecary who had dug them up was very incensed. To bring back to New France, I mean, to try to grow these sort of our native grapes up there. So we cooked up the grapes and just sieved them, a tiny bit of sugar, and then put them in this pastry, and it was just really intense and delicious. And we didn't have to pay with our lives to eat it either, which was purely a plus. All right, I'm going to move on to, and you can see it's all puffed up in that one image, and that just happens the second you take it out of the oven, and then it just sort of relaxes after that back into its original format, but it's quite fun to look at it like a big Jiffy Puff. So the second incident happens on the other side of Cape Cod Bay. You can see the illustration on the of the chart of the Port de Saint Louis, which is Champlain's illustration, which is from the year before his visit to the disastrous visit down to Chatham Way. This is when he visited what was the village of Patuxet in 1605, and where the first English settlers to Plymouth would come in 1620, as you well know. So our event that we'll discuss happens in 1623. And the main source of the information, the main narrative for this is through the lens of Emmanuel Altham. In 1623, in that summer, he had newly arrived just when all the action takes place. He was an investor. His family, his brothers, older brothers, who are gentlemen, his oldest brother is a gentleman, has inherited their father's title. But as a younger brother, he's the one who's sort of sent out to be the, the on the ground representative. He's been given this this position of authority as the leader of this voyage in the colony's new vessel called the Little James. And it's going to go on a fishing voyage, or maybe it's got a letter of marque, which means it's also a privateer, and they're also trading. And he's also all over the place like that. He's full of enthusiasm, and he needs to prove himself. He wants to make a killing and make a fortune so that he can either return to England or set himself up as a gentleman here. And his letters are really wonderful. If you ever would like to read them, they're available in this book, The Three Visitors to New Plymouth, or also you can read them online. But I'm going to read you a little bit of a piece of it because he really captures Plymouth Colony in a way that the people that already live in Plymouth Colony did not. He says, "And now I will speak somewhat of the savages of the country about, I mean the native Indians. The nearest that any dwell unto Plymouth is 14 miles. And now likewise, in this bay wherein we live, in former time hath lived about 2,000 Indians," which is what Champlain saw in that image that I showed you a minute ago. In this image, sorry. "In this bay wherein we live, in former time hath lived about 2,000 Indians. Here is not one living now, nor not one living which belonged to this plantation before we came, so that the ground on which we are planted belongs to nobody." So I'll break here to remind you of the just terrific illness that came amongst these people, especially Patuxet, which was the very epicenter, it seems like, of this disease that struck in 17 through 1619, causing just utter destruction in a way that we can't even imagine. Even those of us having just lived through a pandemic seems so terrible to us. Just imagining that 95, almost 100% of people of one village being wiped out by the European disease, a disease for which they had no immune response. So back to Altham. "And now to speak of the king of the country, who was a great emperor among his people. Upon the occasion of the governor's marriage, since I came, Massasoit was sent for to the wedding, where he came with his wife, the queen, although he had 5 wives. With him came 4 other kings and about 60 men with their bows and arrows, where when they came to our town, we saluted them with the shooting off of many muskets and training our men. And so all the bows and arrows were brought into the governor's house, and he brought the governor there 3 or 4 bucks and a turkey. And now to say somewhat of the great cheer we had at the governor's marriage. We had about 12 pasty venisons, besides others, pieces of roasted venison, and such good cheer in such quantity that I could wish you some of our share. For here we have the best grapes that ever you saw, and the biggest and diverse sorts of plums and nuts, which our business will not suffer us to look for." So you can see he was having a great time. His sort of gee whiz tone continues throughout all of this lengthy and very interesting first letter home to his older brother, Sir Edward Altham. And again, he's enthusiastic about making huge profits through investments and setting himself up as a gentleman either here or up back in England. And he's also very conscious of needing to fulfill the promise of his family's objectives in investing in this colony to start with. Now, I'll remind you that the governor, who's just gotten married in this story, was William Bradford, and he was for many years the governor of the colony. He was dyed-in-the-wool separatist. He was the chronicler of Plymouth Colony and an apologist for the colony throughout his life. When you read Bradford's account of that August, it's a very turbulent state of play. So much has happened within that year that I won't even go into now, but there's a lot going on, and there's a lot riding on the arrival of these ships, the Anne and Little James. In Bradford's own account, he does not mention the wedding, his own wedding. It's very typical of him. And he also doesn't mention that Massasoit and his large retinue visits. But then again, he didn't mention that they visited in 1621 either. So that he has his own angle in giving you the story. And that's why it's interesting to read letters from other people, because you often learn a lot more about what's really going on the ground. And for Massasoit's, for his part, a great deal had happened in his relationship with Plymouth ever since the last time he had checked up there, almost 2 years before. And since those 2 ships of colonists had just arrived and he received an invitation to the wedding, it probably seemed like a good time to pack and leave Soams. It's a good long walk from where sort of Barrington, Rhode Island is now, walk and paddle to arrive all the way at Plymouth. So it's not just, not just a walk in the park to get there. It's a considerable investment of time. And I don't know if you notice the number of people involved. If you do all the math, it adds up to 165 Native people that are coming to this event. And I'll just also remark, for my purposes, this is not only is this the first mention of pastry for Plymouth Colony, it's also the first mention of baking of any sort. So this to me reflects a poverty of documentation rather than any reality on the ground. I'm quite sure they've been baking previously, they just aren't telling us about it. So on to the oven type for Plymouth. The English had their own very specific fix for part of their colonial toolbox that they had developed. They'd been developing the ideas of extending English power and influence and trade, starting out in Wales and Ireland, Cornwall, and then projecting that across the Atlantic into Newfoundland and Virginia. And these ovens are found in all those places. They were made in Barnstable area or Biddeford area of Devon, North Devon, and they're made of very coarse kind of pottery. That one on the left is an original that's in the Museum of London, and one of the best preserved of many that were made. There's pieces of them. There's some that are still in walls, all throughout Wales, where there seem to have been many of them, and they were just built into the masonry in your fireplace. The lower picture on the right is the reproduction of it that I built into a little brick wall that I just sort of mocked up, and they would be built that way so that they basically functioned like an oven in your hearth, just like the colonial ovens we know, except that it was instant. You didn't have to know how to be a mason to do it. You just slammed it in the wall, put some sand around it to absorb heat, and then you're ready to bake. So it's, and it would have a little door. I, once again, forgot to shoot a picture of the door, but the door would allow you to heat it all up and then put the food inside, close the door up, and bake just like you would in any other masonry oven. So shiploads of these things went all over the place wherever the English went. And there are a few remains found in Plymouth Colony. So that's the most likely type of oven for the English at Plymouth. They could be quite capacious, and they were often installed in banks both in Newfoundland and in Virginia. They were found in a little bakehouse, so 2 or 3 of them at a time. How to make a pasty of venison? Well, what is a pasty anyway? A pasty is that's like a folded over turnover, and you can see in this illustration, which is part of this recipe, To Bake Red Deer, from a book, a slightly later book, but one that captures a lot of mid-17th century cooking in England. Much of it very elite, but some middle class stuff too. You can see that thing on the left is, I interpret that to be a pasty. It's a folded over sheet of pastry with the meat, the deer meat, inside it. Which you'll see a little bit better later on. But it's so great to have a diagram of what it's supposed to look like for me. And then the other thing is a pie. It's a sort of schematic of the pie that we saw in the Dutch paintings earlier, where it's a plum-sided cylindrical thing like a pan, but it's made of dough, and you make the dough shell, the coffin, and you fill it up with stuff. You put a lid on there, and you put a little funnel on top of it of pastry, and I'll get into that a little bit in a minute. So this recipe is very similar to so many that are Dutch, English, French of the period, baking venison or sometimes baking beef to taste like venison. Which I'll get into a little bit more in a moment. In this one, you take in this meat and you've boned it and larded it with fat. You've pummeled it and steeped it. In some recipes, you steep it in wine or wine and vinegar with salt, and then you add nutmeg and pepper and cloves to it, bay leaves, and you pack it all into the form of the pie, and you close it up and bake it, essentially. I'll draw your attention here to where it says being baked and cold, fill it up with good sweet clarified butter. That's not if you're going to eat it right then. That's so that you can pack it away for later. So you see down below it says, if you bake it to eat hot, give it but half the seasoning and liquor it with claret wine and good butter, meaning that you, right away as it comes out of the oven, you make a little sauce and you pour it in the funnel on the top, the hole on the top, and let that sort of steep into it. So when you serve it, it's very saucy and delicious. And you also note in the middle of that paragraph at the bottom, the bushel of rye meal being coarsely sourced, meaning sifted, and then made up very stiff with boiling water only. One more thing about the, this is a great picture of, keeping things cold. This is a larder, and you can see several great pies in this. A larder is a room that's meaning for, for keeping things cold, whether they're coming from the table to be recycled for later, or whether they're just newly made. You can see both of those things in this picture. A great version of that, sort of that funnely thing on top of the pie, where you would pour in the either clarified butter or the delicious sauce, depending on whether it's served cold or hot. And then you see a broken up pasty, and you can see inside it, and there's numerous things, which I won't get into, that could be in there by the visuals, but you can see that it's a folded over kind of turnover thing, and you can see that it also had some nice decoration on it that's just hinted at in the engraving. And then I can't help but show you this cute little pie that's on the left-hand side where the rats are, which the rats are ravaging. And you can see how beautifully it's made, where the plum sides are not round, but rather laid up into a great form, just to sort of show off the skill of the pastry maker. Again, here are the presentations that we went into with, and here's our very simplified attempt at it. I made rye paste just as the recipe said, with either very little fat or just hot water. I did use a little duck fat in it, as being a fat that was very available to these people in the throughout the early years of their settlement. And it's inside, it's packed full of venison, again, pummeled up with these, steeped overnight with vinegar and wine, and then dried off, salted well, laid up with butter, nutmeg, cloves, pepper, and then closed up with the top lid. And then baked in the same wood-fired oven that we baked the galette in. And baked for, I didn't mention this when we were looking at the recipe, but some of these recipes for the venison pasty call for baking for 4 and 5 and 6 hours. This is a little one, and so we went for 3 hours. It was literally in that oven for 3 hours. And as with a wood-fired oven, the temperature is dropping as the thing is in there. There's no more heat entering it, so it tends to have a very consolidating effect on anything you bake, and the flavors just become very delicious, and texture is also really wonderful. And that proved to be the case with this. It really just came out of the oven just smelling wonderful and having a great sheen to it. The pastry to me was really successful in that it maintained exactly didn't melt away or in any way lose the decoration, which is nice after you put the effort into it. So I was very pleased with it, and it's really only for following the recipe pretty much exactly. So, and I'll remind you that in Altham's account, he mentions 12 pasties of venison, so that's just one of them. This is how it appears on serving, it makes an impression even just to have one of them. You can see opening it up. They're often served with spoons, showing that the filling should be soft enough to serve. And it was quite tender after 3 hours in that sort of slow heat in the oven, just baking, and really quite good. So, what does that tell us? What's the meaning of these 12 pasties of venison, and what did it say to the people who were there, and what did it say to the Wampanoag guests as well? And use a few context clues to sort of at least begin to guess about that kind of thing. So first of all, providing a splendid wedding feast at it's the European cultural norm. No matter what your status was, you try to push that envelope, step to the very top of your status to provide the best experience you could for your guests and show off as much as you possibly could for your guests, whoever they are. This is a really unusual, wonderful painting from a generation earlier than we're concerned with, but still it's that some of these cultural norms have long stability. So I feel quite secure in using it as a document for this. You can see there's just a great deal going on in here. But for my purposes, the most important stuff's happening right in the middle, where you can see just the details of catering, which aren't to me so great. That we're looking into a cook shop, and you can see the wall of fire behind their spits, and there's 3 spits lined up on that metal framework, and a big bed of coals underneath, and they're roasting a ton of stuff there, which is just a terrific and unusual image. And you can see how well they're set up. There's a guy who's carving and presenting inside there, and there are servants who are going to be carrying it around. And you can see on the right-hand side, the table is laid for a banquet. And you can see in the sort of middle ground there's 4 attendants carrying these things that look like shields. Well, those are pies. They have these amazing looking pies on their chests, and they're like show-off food, just like the pasties venison would be. So a wedding is a very appropriate place to be showing off like that. But there are a few other things to note about this wedding, that the one in Plymouth, that come from the context clues provided by Altham, and also from Bradford himself and from other commenters and what we know about the colony generally. For example, within the English colony group, there's a faction that is entirely scandalized by this wedding, not because of what they ate, but because the people who were married didn't care that they were not going to be married by a member of the clergy. They were separatists, and they thought that people should be married not within the church, because the Bible doesn't say so, but they should be married by some agent of the government or some other some sort of official. So most likely Bradford and Mrs. Southworth were married by one of the assistants to the governor. Bradford himself performed weddings, as we know Edward Winslow did too, and probably other assistants as well. So that did not play well with many of the people who have more orthodox views from England. But back to Massasoit's role in all of this. Partly there's a strangeness that there's the English understanding of him as an emperor and all his men as kings. And that reflects their struggle to understand the indigenous political and social structures. But there's this sort of flattery involved also, the idea that, oh, these elite individuals from another culture are coming to our wedding. Even though that seems like a very sort of modern way to put it, you feel that in the sources that, oh, there's a king who's coming amongst us commoners. The whole idea that they're an other, that plays in a separate category in their minds, that the elite nature of these people is very important in this kind of context to these English. And then there's the fact that Massasoit brought a gift of the venison that certainly smacks of royal privilege in the English mind, because the English sumptuary laws placed venison at the very apex of the desirable meats and restricted the consumption to noble people. So the idea that these commoners are going around eating venison, eating this kind of luxury, while they're living this hardship, that's just that also, as well as having a king and an emperor come to your feast. All those things seem very, they raise the tone of the event in a way. And for the English, making, on the other hand, I guess in my own mind, the very fact that they're taking this venison and making it into pasties, they're taking this natural kingly flesh and then making it into a more artificial, the most artificial way you can possibly make this dish, is transforming it from the natural to the artificial, makes it even more sublime and exciting for all of them to report home about. And it takes any of the sort of feeling of wildness that might be unseemly out of the dish and out of the food. So looking at all of these episodes together, or both of these episodes, what is it that unifies them? Is it just a coincidence that both of these events involve pastry, or is there something that does unify them? In both cases, the European colonizers were manifesting their foodways heritage from home. There's that. They had the knowledge and the ingredients, and the tools to execute these foods, and so they did, because they could. And I get that. I understand, the joy of actually just making things because you can. And in time of hardship, I'm sure that registers even more keenly. But contrasting them, these incidents involve two different sets of Europeans who are somehow motivated to bake these pastries in these crazy adverse conditions. And even though the cast of European characters in these two episodes is probably completely distinct from each other, there is nothing to say that there's no overlap among the indigenous parties. It's not impossible that a Wampanoag man who tried some of the galette from the oven that was there at Port Fortuné after that French debacle, that same person or persons may have in middle age actually been an honored guest at the wedding of the governor in New Plymouth. Surely those four kings who came with Massasoit represented a diversity of the community that Massasoit was in league with. So it's quite possible that there could actually be people that were present out on the Cape in 1606. And there's certainly people that knew about it. There's no way that that event went unremarked in Wampanoag territory. And even if we see these events only from the European angle, and that angle is somewhat more knowable because of the one-sided nature of the documentation I've shown you, there still is a lot of ambiguity. But the moral messages that the pies represent, it's pretty clear in the narratives that have come to us. In the French reports, the galettes, they stand for youthful rebellion and irresponsibility. The selfish and unthinking gluttony and disobedience of the young people throws a spanner in the works of the empire building. Chaos results, and these Frenchmen, and I didn't get into this part of the story, a randomly selected bunch of native men later, they pay for their lives, with their lives for that incident. And notably, the narratives that are penned by the French leadership to justify this act, they neatly shift the blame from the disaster away from themselves and onto the guys, the victims of the attack. By contrast, the venison pasties created in the English colony were made in the service of empire. They projected power by deploying a level of artifice way beyond that they actually needed to process the raw materials for human nourishment. They took Massasoit's gift of the several deer and transformed the flesh so artificially, as I said, so the Plymouth people weren't just taming the wildness of the food, they were imposing an order on the implied disorder of wilderness. They were boxing up these random bits of meat so neatly into that fanciful package that it was a display of their power. So sending the message that they could one up even the most kingly gift from Massasoit in the way they served it back to him. So it's unknown, as I've said, as to how this played on the ground to the 165 Wampanoag people present, but it succeeded really well with Emmanuel Altham, the young Englishman who reported back to the investors. In his letter home, he shows that he's completely charmed by the experience. When you read Bradford, his account of the same period, even though he's not talking about this incident particularly, when he talks about Altham's ship arriving and the companion vessel, the Anne, when they arrived, what he reports is that those new colonists, as they get off the ship and they see all their friends back from who have left England 2 years before, when they see the ragged and terrible condition that these people are in when they arrive, these new arrivals fall on the ground and they weep and moan. They actually just break down when they see the pathetic state of the colony when they arrive. So they don't share Altham's enthusiasm when they arrive. So kind of blowing away Emmanuel Altham with this event and showing off the very best that the colony can do, and knowing their audience, knowing that he's the young son of a gentleman and that putting gentlemanly food in front of him can only make him feel at home, that really does pay off. And throughout his entire report, Altham paints a much more glowing picture of the episode of Plymouth Colony than Bradford can motivate himself to do even at that moment. So in conclusion, I'd like to say thanks to everybody and just remind everyone that who thinks about colonial history, that learning about it requires a lot of leaps of imagination, because we're trying to make connections between the words of unreliable narrators and all these scraps of physical evidence. And for me and for lots of other artists and historians, trying to physically reproduce even a tiny slice of the past takes away a little bit of the frustration that you feel with the lack of documentation. And we feel like we're squeezing a little more information out of that documentation. So having the opportunity to reimagine some of these pies has, for me, sharpened up a tiny little piece, made a tiny little piece of focus in what would otherwise be a very, very hazy picture of the past. So thank you for that opportunity, and I especially want to thank the Alden House Historic Site, the Duxbury Cultural Council, and Jake Walker, who was an amazing photographer, taking pictures of all these actively moving pies. And I also have to get in a hint here, but and also this picture that came up as I was finding images for this, it's just a perfect representation of a wild animal put into a very orderly crust. That's actually that very same turkey put inside a crust to replicate, back in the old days when I worked at a living history museum, to replicate a painting, a Dutch painting that had this crazy turkey pie in it. So that really is, I had to take apart this actual turkey and wire up its neck and put it into this pie made out of that actual turkey's meat. One of the nuttier things I've done for a while. Anyway, I hope some of you have some questions. It's been a pleasure doing this research.
Oh, Paula, thank you. That last image is just amazing. But we were also fascinated by the pies in that one image where they could actually hold them vertically, and nothing seemed to be coming out of them. Anyway, we do have a number of questions and comments in the chat, so I'll go ahead and get started. I know that there's a lot of interest in those ovens and where the clome ovens have been found.
Yes, in Plymouth Colony, there's only one shred of evidence, and part of that, I believe, has to do with it has to do with a number of things. I won't even try to justify why. The only piece that's been discovered was a sharp-eyed archaeologist in the mid-20th century at the Howland site up in Kingston. It was not in situ, but it was sort of in just a bunch of chunks out in a ditch, kind of, which interestingly, when they break, they become large pieces of semi-useful pottery. And I could, in Virginia, they were found in a context in a ditch also where they were kind of used almost like a drainage tile. And it makes me wonder whether that wasn't done in Plymouth as well. But they've been, in the larger scheme of things, there's evidence for them in other places in New England where if you look at the masonry remains, the brick hearths, you can see where there's this very weird little bump outs from the hearth. They were added on after the actual, just the hearth itself. There's this weird little bump out that was apparently built to support a strange oval object. And I'm reading those completely as the supports for a clome oven like that. So yeah, they're and they were a fleeting part of the earliest days of colonizing, because once you got masons and bricks, you could build a much more durable and much larger oven. But for that instant arrival, just having an oven that you could use right away, they were very popular. Where they were found the most was in Newfoundland and in Virginia, and also tended to be in places that had investors or other kinds of trade ties with North Devon, which Plymouth didn't at the outset, but some of Plymouth more 1630s colonists to Massachusetts tended to have those North Devon ties. Dorchester as well, the North Shore colonies, fishing stations and so on had those North Devon ties.
So another question, this one's from Alan Wyman. How much is the mince pie, and from that image that you showed much earlier in the program, that we order at Christmas today, like the mince pie of the 17th century?
Yeah, sometime in the 20th century, the meat dropped out of the mince pie. But previous to that period, it was a way of preserving meat. certain cuts of meat that just were considered particularly good for this, including tongue, all those sort of large, rumpy sorts of pieces of meat. You'd cook them very tender, mince them up very small, mince up a lot of fat. It's a very rich pie. And then cook that together with the sort of unguent deliciousness of spices and wine or cider, depending on where you are. So it's a very juicy, wet mixture. And then often lots of dried fruits, tons of raisins and prunes and currants and that kind of thing. And that you could put away in a crock. And all the way into 19th century Plymouth, there's so many great recipes for mince pie where it's a different flavor principle, but same idea where, and it's like almost like goes from being a Christmas food. And that's one of the problems with mince pie for separatists, is that it was really identified with Christmas. And since they hated Christmas, mince pie was considered, that was mentioned by some Puritans, it was called idolatry in crust. So they really saw it as a very evil influence, but they had to sort of rename it and rebrand it because they liked it. And so they took it away from Christmas and made it just into winter food. So by the 19th century, you could have mince pie all over New England and no one would bring up the C word, Christmas, and ruin everything because Christmas is just a foreboding holiday. So in the 19th century, it became a much more workaday kind of food for busy housewives because they had wood-fired cook stoves in their houses and could bake very easily every day. And so being able to slap out a crust and slam into it a couple scoops of mincemeat, maybe adding a couple chopped apples, bake that and have like dinner ready in an hour, of the kind that, men love to come home to a big greasy mince pie. That was the kind of thing that people loved, and food reformers loved to hate. They just thought they were the most unhealthful things. And there's just lots of information about mince pies in the 19th century comes from people who hated them, but not for religious reasons, but only for health reasons. Long answer, but it's a really, mince pie's fascinating history all on its own, a whole other talk.
So from Pamela comes the question, the image that you showed with that funnel part on the cake, and was that made of pastry or something else?
Yes, just a pastry. So it's tricky because it needs to sort of not fall through, and sometimes you've just got a hole in the pastry, and some of the pie images show just a hole, and very often you'll see just that. But some of the finer ones, you have this sort of, it looks like the sort of the flare out of a daffodil mouth. It's this beautiful little funnel. It's called a tunnel often in sources, and it's really an adornment. But it does help you kind of get the stuff right into the pie when you're pouring in either the fat or sauce.
So a couple of questions about the red deer pastry that you talked about. One was, this one's from Elizabeth, was the approximate temperature of the oven. And then the other one from Patricia asks concerning the large pasties, how was your crust not burned after 3 hours in the oven? And was the crust meant to be eaten as well as the insides?
Yeah, those are great questions. And those are the kinds of things that before doing this, you really don't have an idea. And that's, to me, that gets to a lot of the value of doing this, physically doing this work rather than just reading the sources. So one of the great things about wood-fired oven like that is that you can get it to be, as you get the fire out or as you're burning the fire, it's about 1,000 degrees. If you use a modern thermometer to take its temperature, it's shocking how hot it can be. Once you clear the fire out, the temperature starts to drop right away. But there's a lot of other complications as to the quickness with which that temperature drops, and the just depends on how deeply you've heated it. In a very well heated oven, if you put in something at just the right moment, and I would say to answer the question directly, when I put that venison pasty in there, it was probably around 400 degrees or so, which is pretty hot, right? But it's a lot of cold meat in there, and there's going to be in there a pretty long time. It might have been a shade under that. But I also had oven full of other things. It's not like a modern oven where you put everything in, it's all going to stay at the same temperature. when you put in a lot of stuff, the temperature drops right away with all that cold stuff in there, and then it kind of equalizes back up again. And then as the heat leaves the whole thing, it continues to cool. So there's a lot of sounds like a lot of hedging, but it's really the kind of thing you have to think about when you're doing this. So it may have started close to 400 degrees, and over the 3 hours, by the time we were done, it might have dropped to 250 or something like that. And you can see the pastry was very brown, but it didn't burn because of just sort of the mass of the inside that was just sort of heating up, and the moisture sort of leaving the thing and keeping the whole thing as the coolness is coming out of the inside. You can certainly burn things if the heat is too sharp. I mean, you can put things in there at 600 degrees, and of course they're going to blacken on the outside and never cook on the inside. But there's a great deal of softness to the heat that happens when the temperature is just falling like that. That's very, very forgiving. Another thing that you can do is, if it's burning too much or heating too much on the top or the bottom, is put it up on something. Just put a cold brick underneath it, or even take it out for a little while and just let it sit. There are certain things, if they're risen bread, that are going to just not like that at all. But a pie, you can get away with that, especially when in a sturdy crust like that. Back to the sturdy crust, yes, you can eat it. When it's hot, it's quite good. That one is quite crisp and really delicious. But often when they're cooler, they begin to just not be as good. Then my point with this also is that the guests at an event like that may not be the ones eating the crust. Like if you think about that larder picture, some of those things had already been served and come back from the table. The guests might have pulled out like, I'm going to eat this like delicious lump, and then look at all these other things that are served here. I don't have room to eat one more bite of that. And so you wind up having these, like in the period that say broken meats, things that were just like broken into and stuffed in the larder and hauled out again another day. And then those things eventually, once the higher caste people start finished with them, then servants and paupers and hogs and everyone else got chickens, everyone else got a throw at it. Many times they, in cities in in London, for example, these things would be put out at the gates afterwards for poorer people to eat when they were in their just utterly broken condition. But the entire household would have a go at it first, so they would make their way down through all the sort of classes of people that were present in any given situation. You can bet in Plymouth, for example, that everything got eaten there eventually, and that the higher, the guests, all the guests, and the very special people who were at the ceremony or at the feast would get first crack at it. But then the people that are in the back carving it are just like slipping parts in their mouths when nobody's looking, and that later on, even the folks at home are going to get a piece of this brought back to them. So everything goes to somebody further down the line.
So a question from Ava is, what was the flour like? We know the English didn't have the tradition so much with cornmeal. They brought wheat and rye, but then now they're introduced to corn. So
yeah, so that's what makes these dishes elite, is that one of the main things is they're digging into their supply of English grain. They tried to grow English grain in Plymouth right off the bat, and that didn't go so well. And they quickly found that the native corn was, oddly enough, what did really well here. So they made a transition to growing that, and made their everyday bread out of it. No one tried, as far as I've ever seen, no one tried to make a pie, or no one succeeded ever in making a pie using corn, because the pies were in the 17th century, before leaving Europe, and in every incarnation in sort of the European America, continued to be a very European food. There's no sort of like mixing up as there might be with other foods. For example, you might take a pottage, an English pottage, which is a stewed dish of meat and grain, vegetables. There's a native dish, no matter where you go, that is really quite like that in concept, even though the ingredients are different. But there's nothing like a European pie in native tradition, and you might say vice versa as well for certain native foods. So an English pie or a Dutch pie or a French pie never became, as far as, I shouldn't say never, they resisted becoming anything other than what people remembered from home. So if you didn't have wheat or rye, you're not going to make this. That's the bottom line. That's, I know, for example, those Frenchmen said, well, we're almost out of biscuit, let's bake bread. They have flour. They have probably a butter, which common ship store. So that's why making a galette is not that hard, really. Flour, butter, and water, and then a little scraping of sugar and some fruit. So it's really not that hard. It's just the idea of like, yeah, we're on a beach in the middle of nowhere, pretty shipwrecked. Let's make a pie. That's just so out of the normal way we think about colonizing that it's quite refreshing, even though the whole thing went badly.
So from Alessandra, if you could estimate how much of your historical food information initially comes from cookbooks versus the other historical documents as you gather recipes and ingredients to try to remake these dishes?
That's really hard for me to know. It's all kind of mixed and mashed up together for me. And this is a terrible answer, but I've just been doing it for so long that I really no longer completely know. I think that for me, even reading, I always read recipes, even most inscrutable ones that are from other parts of the world that are, if I read a translation of a Babylonian recipe, or if I, read a pre-Columbian recipe from the Yucatan, or, a description of the food, the first thing I'm thinking of is how to make it. Is there enough information here to make this? And when I'm reading other sources like letters or of Plymouth Plantation or any of these documents or Champlain, I'm always looking for, well, where's the food in this? What are they eating? Where do they get it? What do they have to do to get this? And who's cooking it anyway? And what's the tools they need for it? So it's taking the opposite perspective with each thing. And, the archaeology, to me, my archaeology background and my cooking background are blended together to make the practical side of it. And then the more theoretical parts are both the primary source documents, which include the cookbooks. And they're all primary source documents. There are screwy things in them that just don't make any sense. And that goes for both cookbooks and letters. There are things that we just can't make sense of. But sometimes by triangulating all of these things together, they make up something that is much more meaningful than any one of them on their own, I find. And they help me, like I was saying, imagining. That sounds like a bad word when you talk about the past, but for me, it's that step of imagination that's very important, to allow you to sort of get out of other historians' heads. Because if you read standard historians of this topic of colonization, they're not interested in the same things I'm interested in. If I just read them, I'm not going to get my answers. I have to go back and read the initial sources with my own questions in mind. So non-answer, but that's my answer anyway.
So we also have a question about the ingredients in the pastry itself, and that's from Mary Ellen. And I assume that means the one that, that you were talking about, the deer one, the venison. Yeah.
That one is mostly all freshly ground rye. So I ground up a couple of pounds of rye meal, basically. Didn't even sift it. I might have sifted the worst bran out of it, but that's just what even Robert May says. And he was a very fancy lad, kind of a cook. And I tried making it using a hot water pastry that I'd used previously with a lump of, I can give you in fact, if anyone's interested in very precise measurements, I'd be happy to furnish those, and we can get in touch about that later on. But basically a lump of fat that you just melt in water on the fire. So you've got mostly water, a little bit of fat, and then you just pour that in a well into the flour until it begins to work up. And, I can squeeze it and see, and this will be different flour to flour for sure, just squeeze it and see if it will actually make something that will hold. How gluey is it, and does it crack? And then just play with the proportions. In this particular trial, I finally took the hint from a lot of these period cookbook writers who said, yeah, either pure water or not much fat. And I used less and less fat and found that they're quite right, oddly enough, that the less fat that was involved, the better the pastry worked for this particular. And then, so you're loading up the inside of the pastry with fat. That the recipe is just loaded with larding and butter and all this other kind of stuff. So it's perfectly juicy and fatty inside. And the crust can be quite hard and not particularly tender. It doesn't want to be tender. It needs to be like an encasement on it. So just the flour and water, or meal and water, tends to make that nice firm crust. And for the galette, it's really made just like a modern pastry, a pâte feuilletée in the French standards, where you're working cold butter into as fine a flour as you can afford. So you take out as much bran as you want to, working the cold butter in, and then adding as little water as possible to get it to come up to a firm ball, and then rolling it out. And if you're fancy in the 17th century, same as now, you roll it out, put on some butter, fold it over, roll it out again, and then roll it out, and then you get some, some layering, and they're more closer to a puff pastry. People knew that then, and that's how they would make the more delicate pastry. And if you were not shipwrecked and you were making the same kind of thing for your family in a little more stable situation, that's how a 17th century French pastry maker would make a slightly better version of that galette.
So another question from Alan, and this does have to do with the ovens again. And how much are the baking ovens at Plymouth Patuxet like the original 17th century ovens?
I'm unsure of what they have there right now. That photo of me, that image, let's actually have a better one. This one here, that's from 1990, and we used to exhibit that type of oven back there in those days. And that's a French style oven. It was instituted, that type was done experimentally starting in the very late 70s under the archaeologist Jim Dietz, when he was the curator there. And it was based on new research that came out about the ovens of New France. And they're like, well, why not? And so that became the standard type of oven that we used at that museum for years. And that's the very first oven I ever built in my life, was building one on site there. Not that one, that's pre-existing to my time. And it was really, really great to learn about it. And that caused me to dive into a lot of the literature of oven building, 17th century New France, New England. And that's when I started researching. I was very frustrated by the lack of materials. And so I got really into the archaeology, talked to a lot of archaeologists, went to an archaeology conference in Canada, and then wrote a paper about that very topic for a scholarly book. And that forced me to really, really document about the clome ovens for the English sources, and then these sort of earthen ovens for sort of more temporary use in French colonies, and then often French colonies had much more massive brick or stone ovens as well. And for English colonies, they fairly quickly morphed into having brick ovens by the mid 17th century, built by masons, once there were enough masons here to employ in that way.
So I know this is very, this asks you to generalize a lot, but, how did your typical, Plymouth colony housewife, handle the baking? Was this, would you say, maybe once a week or so, or how much baking did they actually do? And, typically, what were they baking most often?
There's the frustrating lack of documents that I referred to before really plays out here. But in this image, you can see that I'm baking an English sort of bread. That's wheat and rye, risen with, sourdough, essentially. It's very, very common in England. And for English people, that's bread you ate every day. That of a better sort or a worse sort. No matter your station in life, you expect to eat bread with every meal. And the English called, and the French too, called bread the staff of life. And it was really inconceivable that you could live without it. And the French even talk about kind of trying to explain that to native people up in Canada, that they couldn't get that you had to have bread at every meal. However, in Plymouth, because they quickly failed so badly at growing English grain, and they took to growing the native corn so much, and their supply from England was so poor, they had to make, if they were going to make bread, they had to make it out of native corn. And we know they did to a degree. We know they worked very hard at it. And from later sources, we can have some idea of how they did it. But they quickly, when it could, it transmogrified into something that had both wheat and rye mixed into it as well. So it became sort of a hybrid product. But this is by the end of the 17th century. Back in Plymouth, early Plymouth colony, my feeling, and this is based on my own judgment, it's it's documented, but it's not definitive, that the normal way that a Plymouth household would get their calories, that fill their stomachs, it would be by eating the native corn, what they called Indian corn, eating it in samp form as a porridge. And that became and this is documented as being the daily dish of the people. So that you would always have, it's called the standing dish of New England in one of the mid 17th century English sources, having a kettle full of ground cornmeal or corn groat porridge, cooking either in broth, in water, in milk. Having that served at every meal was the foundation of the meal. And so then an erosion of that idea that bread had to be had at every meal happened pretty quickly, much more, I believe, in New England than in New France. So the baking is something, maybe making these 12 venison pasties was like, woohoo, we get to bake, in a colony that already was just like, oh, samp again. Okay, yum, well, we get to eat. And the next generation, they never questioned that. I mean, samp was a huge part of their lives, and it was regarded with affection and understood as the basis for all people to stay alive. And, by within 100 years in New England, people couldn't really imagine often living without that humble as it was as their staff of life. So there's a transition that went on there, and it was not by choice at first, but quickly became enforced by reality.
That's very interesting. And one last question, because I know we've been really keeping you very busy here. So back to the that wonderful celebration of the wedding that's described in that firsthand account, and from Rick Olson, wondering if the big deal that was made of that pasty and the venison pasties and so forth was just really because they really wanted to have a very special celebration. Could it have been, that, you mentioned that maybe there was some, other interpretations of it, but could it have been just a celebration?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the idea that you do your best at a wedding to show off the best you can makes complete sense. But it's hard for us to understand, to take on board fully the idea that this is a meat that you're not allowed to eat at home. This is like a forbidden food in some ways, and like even many of the recipes in the later 17th century for venison or for those kinds of pies, even in the kinds of notebooks that are kept by elite people, even those are full of as many recipes for how to make beef eat like venison as there are for actual venison. So it's not at all normal in England. So this is like super special. So, I mean, that makes super special and odd a little bit. So all of that, is a yes to that question. But there are a lot of layers that are going on there. And, it's easy for us, I think, when we look at events in colonial, as there are often portrayed, to look at an event like that and go, oh, the governor's wedding, and you just picture, oh, here are all the happy colonists at the governor's wedding. But when you imagine that there are potentially at least as many native participants in this wedding as there are English participants, that means something. There's something there in as to what is being put forward. And I definitely All Them's View is the only view we have of it at all. And the fact that he mentions that, it's a huge boon for me that he actually mentions it. I want to reach through the years and just give him the big fat hug. But it made a big impression on him, even though he was of a station to have tasted venison in his life before, unlike everyone else there, pretty much. I mean, every other English person there, I should say.
Paula, thank you so much. I think we've, really pushed our time here, and wonderful questions, and absolutely wonderful presentation. Really helped us understand a lot more about the challenges of life and history in a crust. Again, thanks to the Duxbury Cultural Council for funding this program. Paula, do you want to mention your book again that you have? Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I'll mention a couple things. You mentioned earlier Plymouth Craft, which is an organization that's been on hiatus since the beginning of the pandemic, unfortunately. But once again, someday we will be back to providing experiences in hands-on learning, all kinds of deep traditional crafts, including baking. But also, I have a book out called Cooking with Fire that deals in very pragmatic ways with increasing your ability how to cook in your own fireplace or your fire pit. And if you have a brick oven in your house, how to use it, or if you have a wood-fired oven in your yard, even better, how to extend it. And then even just the most simple ways that you can incorporate historical sources, historic foods into your own meals, which I'd love to hear about people doing.
Paula, thank you again so very much. So on behalf of the Alden Kindred, I want to thank you all for joining us today. Please visit us at alden.org to learn more about Alden House Historic Site and how we preserve and share the legacy of Mayflower passengers, John and Priscilla Alden. Thank you again, and we send our very best wishes to everyone for a very happy Thanksgiving with you, your friends and family. Thank you so much for joining us.